So welcome. I'm Rachael Nemeth. I am the CEO and co-founder of Opus, and I am so excited to be here today for another installment of our Fireside Chats, a really popular series that's for training directors, people managers, operations directors, and business owners across all verticals who employ a frontline or deskless workforce. I have here today two very special guests who will be introducing themselves. The reason why this particular fireside chat really is important to me is not only are these two panelists two people that were really foundational in helping us uncover what the unique qualities of Opus training, and because of their particular background in instructional design and technology, but also because we're going to be digging into what modern learning should and could look like. At Opus, what we do is we help frontline workers move forward in the world of work by training them over text message. The goal for us is to help people stay, learn, and grow at work through accessible and inclusive training. And for us, that means starting with technology that is accessible. So we'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing at Opus, but what we're really going to be digging into today in this fireside chat is what emerging technology looks like in the learning space and what might be missing. So I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves. We have Jonathan Williams here and Sam Barrow. Welcome. I'm so excited to see you. So the two of you were in very early stages of this company helping me do user research, which is where I met you. So Sam, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background and why you're here.
Absolutely. As you know, when we first met, education is a passion of mine, especially adult education. One of the things that I love is that we're moving to a world where education doesn't have to just be in a classroom. And that is just so exciting to me. I've been in the education space for about 15 years. I started in K-12 with the Department of Education in New York, and then moved into tech education. I have been doing the tech education space for about 4 or 5 years now. And that transition from what we were thinking education looked like and what we know it needs to be today is absolutely fascinating.
And we also have Jonathan Williams here.
Yeah, hi folks. Rachael, thanks for the invite and happy to join today. So my name is Jonathan Williams. I'm the Director of Curriculum Development at Trilogy Education Services, which is a 2U Inc. brand. I lead the design and development of technical learning content. I've spent my career in the education space. I like to say that I'm a designer who just happens to be interested in education. So I very much like designing learning solutions, designing learning experiences, and thinking really critically about what those look like so that learning is fun and enjoyable, but it's also effective at the same time. So I think that's kind of the challenge of the learning designer is to balance both of those. So yeah, happy to hop in and chat more today.
Thank you both. Well, we're going to start with a simple question that I like to start off every conversation with, which is the 3 words question. And in the context of this conversation about emerging learning technologies, my question for you is, describe the state of learning technology in 3 words. Who's going to go for it first?
I was like, oh, I can give it a shot. So I think one word, like, and I think this is like very much a COVID kind of thing in my brain is like technology, learning technology is in like enabling, and it's enabling in a lot of ways, like enabling like learning to continue, enabling like teachers and students to connect, managers to employee, like it's enabling a lot of connection for us right now. Learning technology is also, the other word is probably rigid, like there are certain platforms and tools and things that like you have to fit within these little boxes. And if you design within those boxes, your life is going to be great as a learning designer, as a learning experience designer. But anytime you step outside of that box, like it's difficult, right? So I think rigid is the other answer. And then there's, maybe this is a 2-word for my last one, is like a disconnected integration, where there are certain things that are really connected in the learning technology space, and there are some things that really aren't connected in the technology space. So we have like learning experiences that are really disjoint for people in a lot of cases that I think we need to improve. So one is optimistic in terms of like it's enabling, but I think it's a rigid enablement that's also not quite connected in all the right ways. Sam, add 3 more words to that.
I'm actually going to take one of your words. I think enabling is such a great term. I think of the words I would use are optimistic, innovative, and evolving. There are so many things happening in online education. It's astounding where we were. If you think about Blackboard when we were in college, right, and how difficult it was to use. And it's because we didn't know what we were doing at that time. We were trying to translate what a classroom looks like onto a digital platform in the most literal sense. And now that we see that we have mobile technologies, we have things like apps, right? You have mobile websites, but also apps. You have little bite-sized things. You can QR code a lesson somewhere. You know what I mean? There's so many different ways to interact with learning that it is really just a state of innovation at this time. But we're also just learning what we don't know. And that evolution of technology, especially in the learning space, is something I'm so excited to see, because we're making things up as we go, and there's so much space to expand and change what education means today.
I love that part of making it up as we go, because we all know that the dirty little secret about e-learning is just that, where we're all we all have the basic methodology here. We're all trainers, we're all instructional designers who know that the outcome needs to be X and we need to find a way to get there. But I think that's why my 3 words for this particular space when it comes to learning technology is not done yet. We have had, the past 20 years of a really specific kind of asynchronous learning in many ways. I think synchronous is like a kind of different conversation, but just recently, and be it COVID or be it, entering the 2020s, the next decade of history, we're starting to see a big shift, which is why having these conversations is so important. There's just a lot to learn from one another that we're all kind of experimenting and innovating right now. So I'm going to ask another question around definitions, and we're going to have a couple of these conversations a couple of questions in this conversation around what exactly is e-learning? What is electronic learning? If one of you could take this one, and then we're going to go into a little bit deeper.
I'm going to take this one because I feel like it's a trick question sometimes. E-learning to me is the ability to learn on the go. And that can mean so many different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a formal education experience, right? It doesn't have to be something like Canvas or that you're enrolled in a class, not in an institution. But it means that you can access learning in ways that you're not able to access it from, not sitting in a classroom. And that, I get so excited about this, but that e-learning portion of it can be bite-sized micro courses, or it can be a quick quiz that you're doing, or how do you onboard to an app like Slack, right? You can go through and do a little certificate. It's making education accessible in a way that does not tie you to a specific location.
Yeah, I think, for me, e-learning is like learning that's mediated through technology in some way, right? And that can be a heavy technology touch, or that can be a really light technology touch. I had a conversation the other day with someone where they referred to a PDF document as an e-learning. And I was like, oh, that fits the definition, right? Like, it is technology enabled learning. So a PDF attached to an email is an e-learning. Is it the best e-learning? Like, I think that's a question for debate, right? But I think, if at its core, if technology touches the learning experience, we can probably call it e-learning.
I think that's a very generous example. But we see this a lot at Opus, where we see that existing solutions, oftentimes for employers, are kind of, they're more around like the devil Well, you have these job aids, you have a technology that can help distribute them, and typically that's email. And So I think what I would love to know is what are some common misconceptions? I think some of you, both of you alluded to this, but what are some misconceptions that people have around e-learning? Is there any sort of trend that people think, well, this is what it is and it's nothing else, that you continue to see that you kind of need to change people's minds?
I mean, I'm happy to grab this one first. I think, and I don't know, e-learning I think is in constant battle with like in-person learning, right? And I always think that there's like this, I don't know, I've felt this in my career the entire time, that anything online or e-learning is viewed as like lower quality or lesser quality than an in-person experience, when in all actuality, most of the time, e-learning has an instructional designer attached to it. Like there is like an intense focus on quality in the space. So I think there's like a misconception around quality in terms of what it can be, right? Even if, you know, an instructional designer says a PDF is the most effective way to do this training, right? We've thought critically about that versus like bringing everyone into a room to do a training session. So I think there's that misconception along of like quality. And also e-learning is more than just async content as well. And I think our COVID era has taught people that training is more that like there's Zoom, right? There's ways to interact, there are discussions, like you can deeply engage with someone that's really far away from you and you don't have to be physically sitting next to them. So I think I think the tide is turning on that one, but there's more ways than just async. Here's a stack of content, read it, answer questions kind of thing.
I agree wholeheartedly with that, Jonathan. There is a correlation between the way that the workforce is shifting and the way that companies are shifting their operations, and how e-learning is moving as well. You think about the fact that a large portion of America went remote for COVID, right? So we went from being in offices to being a fully remote team almost overnight. And one of the concerns and one of the challenges that managers have was, how do we manage productivity? How do we know that people are engaged? How do we know that people are doing the things that we're supposed to do? And you see that with e-learning as well. Well, if I put it on the computer, how do I know that they're actually paying attention? If I can't see their faces, how do I know that they're putting the effort I think is worth putting into it? And so that, I think, leads to that quality aspect that Jonathan mentioned. You see it in higher education as well. I speak very highly of my degree from Colorado State University because it was a completely online program. But I had to make a hard decision there and determine whether or not that was going to hold the same weight as going in person for that same course. So that quality issue that people perceive is definitely something we need to get past, need to get over, need to understand. I think COVID has helped us shift that mindset pretty drastically in terms of just what engagement looks like from a remote standpoint.
Yeah, and engagement is something I definitely want to dig into. It's this mythical, magical, vague, specific word that it's constantly defined and then redefined. And I think, Sam, something you were just talking about really brings up the concept of LMS, especially in a university setting. But you know, in the world of Opus, it's around the workplace too. I want to start off by defining it. We know that learning LMS means learning management system, but what the F is actually an LMS? Is it something that a user is expected to know what it is that they're on? Is this something just for admins? Can either of you, for somebody who's never heard of an LMS before, describe it for that person?
I can describe it in like what I think an idealized state LMS is, right? Like I think an LMS is it's like a digital hub, a digital campus, so to speak, that all learning activity occurs on, right? So it's a multi-sided platform. You have a side of the platform that is student facing, so giving you access to readings. You can take a quiz or a test, you can submit assignments, you can communicate with your instructor, and then from the instructional side, you can post relevant announcements, share information, return feedback to students. And I think there's maybe a third piece of that, which is like the administrative side. So like as a school, a company, you can kind of oversee, how many classes are running in your space, like how many people are logging into the platform, right? So that's kind of this three-legged stool of a platform that supports learning.
Yeah, I think a hub is a great way to describe it. The other part that I will call out is that it's also a data collection tool. So on the one side, there's the delivery. How do we get things to our participants? How do we make sure that they have access to those things? But then we also get real-time data about who's logging in, what kind of challenges people are facing. Can we do surveys? Can we do quizzes? There's just access to data that we don't have in our current structure. Or if you think about grade books and how people love to write on paper, how long does it take to get that information into a computer to then get data on your program and how it's performing? So in addition to being that way to deliver content, it's a way to collect information about your programs and really assess whether the program is doing what it needs to do for the students or participants.
Mm. So this is interesting. And Jonathan, you actually just said something to me. You just said something just now that kind of sparked a thought in me just for us at Opus. So at Opus, we encounter a lot of businesses. 70% of businesses that employ frontline teams have some kind of LMS, whether it's from 1991 and just kind of sits there and holds information, or whether it's a more modern form of LMS, which is highly interactive, usually web-based, sometimes mobile-based. But you said something interesting where you said there's three roles here. There's the learner, there's the instructor, and then there's the administrator. Something that we see at Opus is this fourth role, and it's the manager, who is in many ways, are the on-site instructor, but is very rarely interacting with the LMS in the way that we might in a university setting. And so I guess that leads me to, I know that the both of you are like very tuned in to this space right now. So what are we seeing in the world of LMS that's different than what we saw in the early aughts? Has it changed at all?
One thing I'm seeing, I work as a program manager. I didn't actually say what I do for a living, but I work at a program manager for a staffing and technology company. And we recently introduced an LMS to a very large company that's pretty old in its ways. There's like construction-based things and whatnot. So they are used to doing the things that they have been doing. One of the ways we have been changing that conversation is using data and analytics, which did not exist openly and easily for managers or even folks who are running programs to see. So in platform, being able to ask and say, I need to know the performance of this program, XYZ, that has been absolutely amazing. The other part to it is this kind of self-service aspect of it. So allowing folks to go in and enroll in a course or just like find information on their own. There's been just those two things alone have changed what asynchronous can mean for either workforces or the participants themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the data that's accessible, right, and the decisions that can be made. Like there's a course that I've worked on recently where we're using an LMS that a student answers questions throughout the async content, and the rest of the content updates based on how they've answered those questions, right? So I think that like we weren't seeing that 20 years ago, right? In terms of like, there's this notion of like personalized learning, and that's not truly personalized learning, but it's getting there, right? So I think we're getting to that state. On the LMS front. There's also just more novel interactions, I think, for content. Like learning content is vying for eyeballs, right? Like we're competing against like the Netflix, right? Like you can just go watch a doc on Netflix, right? And you learn a ton from doing that versus like coming to an LMS to do it. So I think the interactive nature of learning content is changing. Like some of the content I work on, we have like in-platform interactions where you're doing kind of like manipulatives on screen, or a video might be pausing and you might receive a prompt for a question that then the video moves forward, right? So we're developing content that is hyper interactive. And I think part of that is, well, one, the LMS has to support that content type so that it can like serve it up to students, but it also like it's helping bring interest back to the LMS, right? I don't think before LMSs weren't meant to be desirable places to be. And I think we're starting to be like, oh, if we want people to learn with us, we have to make our LMS a place that we want to hang out. It has to be like, it's like that third space mentality that the LMS is a space that you can hang out and it's fun to hang out there and it's fun to learn. So I think that that's a shift that was not there, decades ago when LMSs kind of hit the scene.
Can I add something? And I can't believe I haven't said this already, but accessibility is such a big thing to me. And accessibility has a couple of different definitions, but in this space that I think about, there are accessibility to different types of families and folks. So if you are a working parent, can you go to school on, in the middle of the night? And the answer is yes, now you can do that. If you have something like ADHD and you have trouble focusing and you need to be able to manage the way that you're interacting with the content, that's available now. If you need something that is compatible with screen readers, that is something that we're doing now, right? We're not just getting flat PDFs that can't do OCR recognition. We actually have these tiny things that didn't seem attainable back when technology was just starting out. Now it's par for the course. People expect your content to be accessible. They expect to be able to work it into their daily lives. And our LMS has had to adjust to that because you cannot compete if you are just doing what was happening 20 years ago, right? Now that there are so many different ways to do this, Opus is a great example, right? We can do this via text message and people will enjoy that and they will like it and they don't have to read a 25-page PDF. And here's what you need to do to make sure that your participants are interested in what you're doing and able to access what you're doing. So I think that's been a huge shift as well. And it's still influencing the way technology is evolving day over day.
The accessibility piece is something we talk about all the time at Opus. The thing that I have qualms with, and maybe it's because I've studied language for way too long, it's that the word management is in the acronym. It's so frustrating to me that we're talking about managing this system because, I think, and I actually don't know the history of LMS. This should be a long form article that I write, but the beginnings of the LMS, but as if I think we're the only 3 people that would read it, maybe, but that's okay. Jonathan, you were saying something earlier about how when it comes to technology platforms like Trilogy and like Opus, we take on the burden of instructional design. We say, you don't need to hire an instructional designer. We're going to handle that. All you need to do is make decisions about content and people and time, and everything else should handle itself. So I don't know, maybe I'm just a stickler for, maybe it's time for us to relabel this as something different. Who knows what it could be, but it's like, I always see the LMS as the platform that I use, because Sam, like you, I earned my master's half online and half in person. I couldn't go in person all the time, and so I'm grateful for those opportunities. But even at the time, it always kind of felt strange to me to use the term LMS when it was like, what am I managing exactly here? Anyway, I'm overthinking things, I bet.
No, I think it's like a learning delivery system works and covers what it does. Right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, LD.
We could make a case for this. Yes.
Okay.
Make a case for this.
I also think it's branding to the student, right? To the user, like what that is, right? Like the kind of the learning management system that we use at Trilogy, we call it boot camp spot, right? So to students, they know it as the spot they go for their boot camp content, right? So they don't know it as an LMS, they know it as a place, a name, like in their other like universities that, call it digital campus or my campus or whatever. So I think that, industry folks know it as an LMS, right? But I think about how we present it, it makes it feel user friendly, right? For folks, again, creating that place they want to come back to.
Yeah. Well, with that in mind, I have one more question about LMS, and then I want to dig into just what sort of new technologies you're seeing, what you're excited about. But I want to talk about features. We have a lot of people watching here who are using these technologies, who are interested in implementing them. From your perspective, you've pretty much seen everything. So what are some, this is a two-part question. The first is, what are some really fundamental features that a learning, let's call it a learning platform, should have? And what are some interesting, more modern features that they didn't always have, but which you're seeing as really critical to either the admin experience or the learning experience?
I think for me, some of the like critical things that an LMS should do, like, I mean, it's first and foremost, it's like a communication platform. So if there's no way to like have two-way dialogue or like one-to-many, like all forms of communication, one-to-one, one-to-many, one-to-two, like that is like a table stakes. It has to have a like a mechanism for feedback and like for folks to understand where they're at and where they're going in terms of progress. You know, there's never been an LMS that I've just looked at, any LMS, and I'm like, it has everything I want, right? But like those are the two things. Like if there's no way to communicate and no way to give feedback, then it's like it's a hard no on that front. Yeah, Sam, add to that. I don't know. Those are my, I guess, my two, like you got to have those or it's not an LMS at all.
I agree with you 100%. Two things I would add is that it needs to have a way to deliver different types of content, right? There are different learning styles. So people should be able to access things in different ways. If you could only do reading in a PDF or a static PowerPoint, then I might as well just email out a PDF or a PowerPoint. So making sure that it can support different types of rich content. The other thing that, I don't know if this is a feature, but usability is so often secondary to, participant usability is often second to the design of the platform. I don't think about how your participants will navigate through that platform. I remember, and Canvas has come a long way, but I remember the first time I logged into Canvas and like we had to have a list of where everything lived. And like, if you want this document, you need to click into this link and then go to this pin thing. And like, I'm not going to do that, but thank you for asking, right? So it's so much of how your participants will interact with that, because that will influence how much support you have to put behind this platform, right? If people can't navigate it, they're always going to be asking you questions. It's always going to be frustrating. It's not going to be a good experience. And so making sure that that is part of the design of a platform and that someone is testing, going in as a user and seeing what that looks like, and you're not just sold on the admin side of it. That's like huge for me, because I've just seen so many where I'm like, if I was asked to do this, I would not do it. And I understand where people are coming from when they get to that point.
I 1000% agree, and I'm biased because of Opus, but we've encountered this so many times, and it was a big part of our user research where we saw all of the LMS and we said, yes, we're going to build something, but we started by actually building for the end user without a UI or with a very like basic UI that could just deliver text messages. But I think that really served us well in thinking differently around what ultimately the administrative experience would be. So I think like the message here is to implore technologists and builders to perhaps take a risk and say, I'm going to start with the participant first, or I'm going to make sure that I'm incorporating that into this platform as well. And I understand the reasoning, right? The people who are buying it are rarely the participant. Now we're seeing changes in that, but traditionally it was the university purchases the platform or the business purchases the platform. And so they're the ones that we need to appeal to. It seems like we're entering an age though, where that's not satisfactory anymore.
Oh, I completely agree. And it's not, I mean, I've worked on some proprietary learning management systems that have like over prioritized, this is going to sound horrible, but have over prioritized student experience on platform. So much so that the student experience is like, oh my gosh, hold on to your seats, folks, because it's like, it's going to be a great learning experience. But then to update something like a period was missing in a paragraph, right? As a learning designer, as a content designer, I needed to know how to write code in order to edit that, right? I needed to know how to edit code. So that's not great, right? Like, so if like the prioritization has to be like shared equally, and I think that democratizes learning, right? Like not everybody is a technologist. Like some people are educators, and you're not necessarily an educator plus a technologist to be able to deliver a great experience. So thinking back to the stool metaphor, right? Like the platforms have to be designed to be usable by all people, or to the fourth, the manager that you're mentioning, Rachel, right? Like it has to be good for everyone. It can't just be good for the students at the end of the day too.
I'm going to segue into a question that I think a lot of our viewers, this wasn't actually one of the questions that I sent y'all, but based on what we're discussing and hearing what I'm hearing, can you talk a little bit about what exactly an instructional designer does? What's their job? You're laughing, Jonathan.
I know.
Jonathan, tell us.
Yeah, it's what does an instructional designer do? I think so. There's a couple pieces. So I think an instructional designer starts at like content strategy and learning strategy level to help a subject matter expert, a university, whoever the client might be, figure out what it is we are training and what our desired outcome is, right? So there's that piece of it. So there's the design piece, and then there's the development piece where you actually work to make the vision come to life. So developing videos, learning content, PowerPoints, PDFs, question sets, like literally whatever assets are in service to the learning experience, and an instructional designer helps shape and really guides that process to ensure that one, there's like rigor in it if rigor is involved, that it's up to production standards, those sorts of things. And then instructional designers often follow through that learning experience to see it through its first couple of runs. So like when these assets go into production, are they performing as we expect, or do we need to modify them, right? A good instructional designer designs a program, or I think that they have set it up so that it functions, and then they can kind of walk away from it, right? And the system is like, you've enabled a system of learning that it doesn't require an instructional designer to constantly monitor that, right? It might be time for iterations to come back in, but yeah, at a high level, I think instructional designers design the experience from strategy out to the first couple of executions of whatever that experience might be.
I'd like to add something, but it's a slightly different answer to your question. So I've always been on the operations side. I've actually recently started a nonprofit, and I build all of my content for that. But for my actual jobs, I do the implementation of programs. And one of the things that Jonathan just said is like why I enjoyed working with him in the past is that there is a strategy, there's a plan, and there's a way to do that implementation, and you can walk away and know that this program is still going to be successful. And so you mentioned operation directors and people who are doing that portion and looking at an LMS and things like that. Just the amount of time saved being able to implement something that is like pick up and go, the things that you can do now that you don't have to be so people heavy on running a program is really, really interesting. And when you have an instructional designer, you have someone building content that understands that the delivery of content through technology is actually enabling you to expand what you're offering. It changes, I think, the way learning happens in the workplace and in non-traditional environments so much, but that strategy and that implementation has to go hand in hand. Your instructional designer and your operations folk need to be working together to understand how delivery is supposed to work and how an LMS is supporting that delivery.
And there, I completely agree with this, because the other aspect of it is like the need for those instructional designers, and you're both saying this loud and clear. These are researchers, these are collaborators, these are individuals who are taking on that initial big leap to really understand who the end users will be and the learners, but also who am I handing this off to? Who will be developing the content moving forward, and what sort of structure do I need to build for that person? So thank you. That's super helpful. And I think it's going to be helpful for our listeners who are also thinking about, and I say this really candidly with a message to all of our listeners, because I see all of you and all the job postings right now. Oftentimes we're seeing folks who are hiring, they're sort of waffling between, do I need to hire an LMS administrator? Do I need to hire an instructional designer? Do I need to contract someone? Do I need anyone at all? Our belief at Opus is we're going to partner with the instructional designers. We're going to be the people so that you can really worry about content. What you want to put in can be beautifully delivered. But I think from like a larger organizational standpoint, at universities, at enterprise companies, there is a requirement to really think through what that job is. And I'm, of course, speaking specifically in the context of work, but in general, it's helpful to hear more about what that job must entail and what level of expertise is required.
Yeah, one thing to add to that I think is important is that an instructional designer can't operate alone. We always need a subject matter expert. Like, we can help you create content. I can help you write content, right? But I don't know that the nuance of your business or your problem, right, to actually start to find the right training content, right? So I think, Rachel, to your point, it's like you as the organization, you bring the subject matter expertise, and that is like the one critical piece you have to bring to make instructional design successful kind of in any context on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually brings me to methodology. So I did a very small amount of research, but what I learned is that about asynchronous learning is that it's really was a 20th century innovation that actually started to take hold in the 80s in universities. And I'm sure, Jonathan, I know you worked in several universities, so you probably saw the sort of rumblings of this, but there have been conversations since then about asynchronous learning for years now. But we're starting to see, and you alluded to this earlier, Jonathan, we're starting to see a big shift back into conversations around what synchronous learning is, what synchronous online learning is. So what's contributing to that shift? Are we going back to only synchronous learning? Are we going into blended models? What is changing right now in the world when it comes to async versus sync?
I can kick this off. I'm actually really curious to hear Sam's thought on this, though. I think, so there was a point in my instructional design career, someone asked me, they were like, do you want to be like an e-learning or do you want to be like a classroom instructional designer, right? And I remember that question being like, neither, right? Like the best path forward is actually both, right? That the learning experiences we design should thoughtfully employ synchronous moments, and they should thoughtfully employ asynchronous moments. And an instructional designer that can pull both from the toolkit is actually the most effective at what they do. And I think the world moving forward will have more asynchronous moments in them, but the difference being that those moments will be very thoughtful about when they're employed. And I think in the past, we've kind of just prescribed asynchronous learning sometimes. It's like, yeah, we're just going to put it online and people will access, but that's not thoughtful. And I think we'll be thoughtful going forward about how we employ asynchronous learning, right? And I think that is the shift that we'll see in time. So, in asynchronous learning, like a history note is like even though it like came about in like the 80s, right? And we're like seeing like digital forms of it. Before that, there was like this notion of correspondence courses where students would get like packets of like learning materials in the mail to like complete university degrees, right? So like async content has been around for a very, very long time, and people can learn from it, right? I think we're just like doing this like modern reckoning of like what it means to be async.
I love it, Jonathan. This is one of my favorite conversations because you don't need to choose either one. And I think that's what we're seeing now. One of the reasons that asynchronous content was so desirable was because it was a time-saving thing, especially in the business sense. You can go do this on your own when you have free time, complete this, come back to us. That, for a lot of people, can be very boring. But for a business, there's some incentive there to, not have people doing this on their time. I think what we're seeing now is that with the advent of remote communication tools, so you think about WhatsApp, Zoom, Slack, Discord, all of these things, there's now a way to interact with folks in a very organic way. And so bringing synchronous learning back into the mix is letting us determine what kind of content is best learned in a group setting and what kind of content is best learned for you to digest on your own. right now we're having a conversation about what e-learning looks like and what synchronous and asynchronous looks like as well. But Rachel, you sent us a list of questions, and that's our async learning. That's us understanding what we need to know for this conversation, and then shifting to let's come together and have a thoughtful conversation. So I think what we're seeing is that we have better technology and we have a better understanding of how to utilize that technology. And it's a lot more collaborative than it used to be. So you can send me a Google Doc and I can ask you comments right now and we can have that conversation. It doesn't mean that I don't need to talk to you tomorrow about what we want to discuss. I don't think we're going backwards. I think we're just understanding what we have access to and building an environment that allows us to get the best of both worlds.
You know, Sam, my biggest takeaway there was something that gave me chills. At the very start, you gave me, I felt like you were talking to me, permission to not have to make a decision. And I think like that's so important though, for all of the training directors out there that are getting pressure from, the CEO or the COO, because they read a great article around synchronous training and they're like, we have to do this. But really the answer is, well, it's not actually about the methodology itself. We know that the methodology works, whether it's sync or async, but it's actually about what content you're looking to deliver, and more importantly, what outcomes you aim to achieve. We just released a synchronous learning experience at Opus, which was very hard for us to understand what it might look like on text message. For us, what it looks like is that an administrator, which in this case is a manager, can reassign a course as active for a group or groups of users so that they can gather around, text a keyword and take that course, or in many cases, a single lesson privately, and then come together in that moment after 3 minutes of learning and discuss it. It's sort of our way of digitizing your teacher or like the presentation moment, so that the GM can come back and say, all right, let's talk about this. What was confusing? What worked? I saw that, 50% of you answered this question wrong. Let's discuss. So it lightens the load on that manager to do the presentation and actually puts more of that opportunity for them to do what they do best, which is to mentor and give feedback and really have those discussions, which I think is what I love about e-learning. It's not, in some cases, it's going to replace some like elements of your in-person learning, but I tend to think that if anything, it enhances it, and it really enables you to use more content. There isn't a dearth of content in anywhere. And we do not have a content problem in the world, but it's around distribution and what methodology we're enabling. Because it seems to me oftentimes the problem here is like we all get paralyzed by the decision of, well, which am I going to Zoom this? Am I going to PDF it? Am I going to, chat it to people? So it almost seems like e-learning can help serve businesses and learners best by helping people make those decisions. Almost, that's like the ultimate experience.
Yeah, I think one more comment. I think when we think of like async versus sync, a lot of times I think we think that there's like a prescribed sequence that typically asynchronous learning precedes synchronous learning, right? Like you have to do something async before you do it sync. Like you can play with that. Like I've designed learning experiences where you do the introduction synchronously, and then the async is actually going deeper in to like more nuance into the things that are presented. So I think we often think it's async then sync, but it can be sync then async. It can be like any pattern of that. So you're not held to that one kind of traditional model.
I was just going to add you get the flexibility to change. You might have decided something should be async, and you're realizing based on the data, it's actually not working out. We probably should make this part of the content synchronous, but then we can change something else. So just because you start out one way doesn't mean that you're stuck that way. And this is a great opportunity for you to collect data around that learning and determine what's the best way to deliver it to your students or participants, whoever those are. But just because you started one way doesn't mean that you have to continue that way. And the fact that it's digital allows you a lot more flexibility and speed in making those adjustments as needed.
Yeah, the power to change and iterate is something I think a lot of folks feel like they don't always have permission to do. Like I had a previous discussion with an instructional design team that we work with, Learn Jam, and we had this question of when is a lesson done? How do you know that a lesson's done? Which is, we're having this conversation internally at Opus. What does publish mean? Does it mean that the lesson is done? And it's this like, it's kind of blowing all of our minds right now, but it's a really interesting, it's a whole other fireside chat, to be perfectly honest. So I want to drift into self-paced learning. We've been alluding to it a lot. We're in this conversation right now around methodology. And so I'm pulling a quote now from a well-known e-learning website that I will be sure to follow up on, but for the purposes of this fireside chat, I will abstain from saying it. They said, the market for self-paced learning is on the decline. Self-paced e-learning solutions were first set up by MOOCs as a way to provide customers with flexibility. However, the industry, especially in the US, is moving away from this modality. Self-paced learning sounds like a good idea in theory, but providers have found that in general, most people don't complete their courses. E-learning providers are therefore experimenting with new methods to keep people engaged in learning. So my question for the two of you is, do you agree with that sentiment? Are you actually seeing a decline in self-paced learning? Or do you agree that self-paced learning doesn't work? And if that's true, is there a way that it can work?
I have very strong feelings about this, so just pardon me if I get really
I thought you might.
energetic. I have such strong feelings on this. When you think of education as a business model, I can see where this is coming from. People don't want to enroll in a formalized course. They don't necessarily want to pay for a course. But to me, the whole point is that we've democratized information so much that folks can go and do their own self-paced learning. So one of the things I've been doing is learning about birds. I found out that pigeons are called rock doves, and it blew my mind. So like, that is a pigeon. I've seen pigeons my entire life. And I spent hours reading about different types of pigeons, where they came from, where, like there's only 2 strains of them. I've learned so much, but I didn't have to enroll in a formal course to get that information. I could Google it, I could go on Wikipedia, I could go on Twitter. So you think about all the places people can get information from. My take on this is that we need to reevaluate what people find valuable. Time is really important to folks now. We are a hyper-productive culture, and that goes for us and lots of other countries as well. And so sitting in a formalized 1 to 6 hour class is not necessary. And a certificate for something is not necessary. You can demonstrate that you have the information, you know the information in ways that I think MLOCs were planning on. Like, you can take this 5-hour course and now you have a certificate in like basic American history. And that's not necessary anymore. So people are doing their own self-paced learning. People are exploring things. You think about how active folks are in the political space now, and what you can read about and learn about and just join for free without that formalized aspect around it. So I don't think self-paced learning is on the decline at all. I think folks are able to choose how they learn, and they are choosing that flexibility. And that is moving away from these more formalized business models. And we're seeing them learn in other spaces. But yeah, I don't agree with this statement at all. I think it makes sense from a business aspect, but from an educator's standpoint, this is what we want to be seeing, that people are learning on their own and pursuing that information.
Yeah, I think if your self-paced learning numbers are dropping, or you're not seeing the numbers you want, I think there's probably a misalignment with motivation between you, your course, and your learner. Like some of the programs I work on at Trilogy, like there's a very large component of these programs that are self-paced, but people still complete them. And I think it's because we've really made sure that we understand the market and our customers and what people are wanting, right? So that self-paced content feels productive for them, right? I think that's the piece, is like, can you align internal and external motivations? And if that can be paired with a self-paced piece of learning content, then you have a powerful duo. So, marketplaces with just like tons of self-paced courses that people don't know the pathway through or like what they're working towards, those will never work, right? And if there's intentionality behind it, yes to self-paced learning, I think is my point of view there.
So this conversation about self-paced is good to hear. And I love hearing that like there's this aspect of self-motivation too that we need to be thinking about. And also that, and it's sort of stemming back to what you were saying before, Sam, around data. Some of this data we're not going to be able to track. Think about the work context, for example, maybe somebody goes home and they watch a YouTube video about how to repair that furnace. We're not going to know about that, but they might come back to work the next day and be doubly motivated to complete that course because they were fascinated. There's all of these things that, Jonathan, you were alluding to Netflix and the things that we learn just in our personal lives. There's just so much content to consume. Of course, the downside to that is that there's so much decision making we have to do on a daily basis. There's so much information that, and there's all of these studies that show that the global attention span is shrinking, that for multiple reasons. Some of it's social media, some of it is that there's a lot of information to consume, and our ability to make those decisions, those micro decisions, is pretty exhausting. In this conversation, we're actually not going to talk about micro training because I know it's a buzzword and everyone loves it. We can definitely say it. It's not a taboo word. But I actually want to talk about long form training. So when we think about global attention spans, I just was alluding to this. Is it doomed? Are the 2-hour lectures, are the 60-minute Zoom calls, are they done for? And are we definitely going down a pathway of everything should be digested into smaller pieces just by nature of where the human brain is moving?
I don't think that's the case at all. There's a couple of things on that aspect, right? So because information is available in ways that it wasn't before, we can open up pathways and like introduce folks to new concepts that they didn't consider. And so one of the reasons I went and got my master's degree is because I learned that I like teaching people. I love adult education, but I didn't know that was a thing I could do. I had no idea. And then I found out, and I was working full time and thought, well, how am I supposed to do this? I want to learn, I want to go deeper into this, but there's no way for me to do it. And online learning allowed me to take that path. That includes lectures, that includes, watching videos for 45 minutes, but it's something I'm interested in. And to go back to Jonathan's like self-motivation, what are people interested in knowing about, and how do we deliver that content are the things that are going to allow us to continue down this path. You think about podcasts, people are listening to podcasts. They're hours long, and people are super into that because the way that it's being delivered fits into the way that people are living their lives right now. For some folks, like I'm actually not a person who enjoys being on Zoom all the time. For meetings, I prefer to work by myself and then come and talk to you for brainstorm for like 60 minutes, but it's not my whole day. It's not how I want to operate. And so I think, again, this is just a shift in how we can use technology, a shift in how information is delivered that we need to adjust to. But people are still interested in having deep and long conversations with folks. People still want to see other human beings. Folks still want to hear instead of just reading 45 pages of content. So this goes back to delivery, back to rich content, back to like evaluating your market and what people are used to seeing and wanting to learn, because that's where they're going to put their attention. I don't think long form is going away by any means. I think it's just we're changing what we're interested in.
Yeah.
Sam, I have not met a single person who likes being on Zoom all day. I'm just going to add that.
I actually work in a company where we're like, we can't wait till we get back to the office. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. I'm actually really productive at home.
Jonathan, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna echo, like, we need like long form thinking in society, right? And like you don't get long form thinking in society with short form training, right? I think, I mean, there's been a big push, like at all levels, right, for like diversity, equity, and inclusion training, right? That's not a 5-minute conversation. right? You need an hour, 2 hours to even just start to scratch the surface of that, right? So to think that all training topics can be modular, they can be accessed in 5 minutes, I think it doesn't do the topic, it doesn't do it justice, right? And so I think that, those types of conversations are one that you have to engage like an instructional designer mindset, saying like, what do we want to train? And can it actually be broken apart into 5-minute chunks? And if it can, great. But if not, then you have to be open to letting the conversation or the learning experience be longer than that, because then you start to sacrifice on outcomes, right? And the whole point of learning is that we reach an outcome of some sort. And the training has to match that, right? So short or long to get us there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think that like the definition of long form training can be flexible, where it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you're sitting down for 2 hours. It can just mean that it's 2 hours of content that you're consuming over the course of a period of 12 days without shifting focus to something else. This is the most important thing right now, and this is what I'm learning. So I feel like there's room for builders, creators, teachers to be a little bit more open-minded about what long-form training could possibly be. It's not necessarily that, micro training is getting the spotlight right now, but even micro training has a million different definitions. And that brings me to the next question, which is the enigmatic word of the hour, engagement. It's the word that we always talk about. I just had an hour-and-a-half conversation with my head of product about it, because it changes so often, and at the same time, it always is like this really important aspect of how we measure the success or how we perceive the success of a program. My question, this is a two-parter. So the first, I just want to focus on engagement versus efficacy. What's the difference? Which one matters? Does one matter more?
Jonathan, I have feelings, but I have feelings on everything. Do you want to go first or? Okay. I think they're equally important and they feed into each other. If your program is effective, then people are going to be engaged, and vice versa. People are engaged, then your program is effective. There's no world in which you make the most boring training in the world and everyone is like, yes, I've learned everything I need to know and I'm good for the next 6 years. I think OSHA 10 is actually a really good example. OSHA 10 is an industry standard safety for like if you're doing general labor, construction, any of that stuff. It's a 10-hour course. You can take it online. You cannot take more than 7.5 hours in one day, specifically because they know that folks are just going to click that button. It becomes super inefficient because folks just want to get to the end of it. And so how do you make sure that that's not the way people are going through your training? If they can just breeze through, click through, read all the things, and it feels good to them, but you're not getting the outcomes you're looking for, you're not seeing people score appropriately and things like that, then your engagement, there's an issue there. I don't think you can have one without the other. I think this goes back to Jonathan talking about instructional designers and kind of where they fit in the long-term goal of a program. But there's like engagement is so important as actually think like a metric of whether or not your program is effective, right? They're kind of interchanged in that way.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like engagement is like, is the learner showing up to this experience to learn from it, right? Like, are they like still coming back to the platform, to the classroom, right? Like, and once they get there, are they sitting there and clicking through the buttons, or are they like trying to be a key player in the learning experience, right? And I think that's like what engagement, like, are you just showing up to learn, right? Now you can show up to learn and you can be super jazzed about the experience, but it might not be very effective, right? If we're training you for, to do job role A and you still can't do that, you might have had a great time, in our learning experience, right? But then you don't meet the learning outcomes, right? So that's a problem too, right? So it's like, Sam, I think to your point, you kind of want both of them to make it work, right? Because one without the other, either you're going to have a training that's highly effective, but people like either didn't want to be there, or they didn't show up for part of the experience. That's a problem. So whenever they're not in sync, that's a problem with the learning experience. I know I said earlier, I like to think about like how we make learning fun. I think on the engagement front, it's not always about fun, right? Like every corner of a learning opportunity does not have to be fun. I think it has to keep you interested, though, right?
This is blasphemy, Jonathan.
Right.
We're here for fun only.
Right. But then you like bleed into edutainment, right? And I'm not in the business of creating edutainment, right? So I think that, it's not about like high fun, high engagement, high energy all the time. That also burns learners out to be that engaged on, like being on all the time. So I think you have to know when to turn it off, and like when to engage is important as well. But Rachel, to your point, it's elusive, right? In terms of what actually defines it, because I mean those are those are squishy feely in terms.
Yeah, and I there was like a couple of things that sort of popped into my brain when the both of you were talking, because I agree with all of this. It's like, it's such a, and I say this like running an education company, but like, I think engagement is kind of foolish sometimes. It's an important thought. And it's something that we should always be discussing and aiming to define. But if we're just drilling down into like, that's the only metric that matters, then we're losing the whole board. We're just paying attention to one pawn, and we're forgetting about the things that actually, for us, the KPIs at Opus are, yes, you engaged, you completed your course, you did it with X% of accuracy for sure, but did you go back and you teach a colleague that what you just learned? Or did you ask a question? Did you give meaningful feedback to the person who created the course, whether it's your manager or the HR director, who what have you. So the other thing that comes to mind, though, is this aspect of fun. And I feel like I agree with the both of you. Like, fun is important, but it can become really undignified very quickly and can be patronizing if you're not careful. So just putting the stamp of fun on learning, especially adult learning, can be very damaging to the outcomes that you're looking for. I tend to lean more toward, is it interesting? Are you actually like, teaching an interesting fact or engaging in, we use a lot of scenario-based training at Opus. So are you actually making somebody think critically and use deductive reasoning to learn, rather than just asking them to answer a true false each time, which I think is effective in some ways, and in other ways, it requires a deeper form of learning. So that brings about the next question of this, which is, when is it, and perhaps you have some specific examples, but when is it reasonable for completion to be the metric, and when is it not? Or are we talking about something broader here?
I mean, I think I can kick this one off. I think completion is something I care about critically, but I work with universities to deliver university programs, right? And I think universities want their students to succeed at their core. And so completion of conferring a certificate, conferring a degree is central to that success beyond the university, right? So I think completion matters there. When I think about it in other work or other contexts, maybe like a work context, I don't know if I think completion matters as much, right? I think one thing that continually shocks me about adult learners is their selective nature. That an adult learner will be like, I watched half of this training and I think I got everything that I need from it. And like, we should kind of trust their judgment. So like completion should be up to them, right? Like that wreaks havoc on our engagement numbers, right? And maybe, how effective the training will be perceived, right? But I think adult learners know what they know, and we have to listen to that at every step of the way. So I don't know, it's like there's an opt-out button and you can like describe why you're opting out. I know there are cases like degrees and certificate programs where completion, like, yes, that will only help you to complete, but in other adult learning contexts, it might be informal or non-traditional. I don't think that, completion is as necessary.
I think that's a great distinction, Jonathan. My first instinct was no, completion is not a great metric for most of anything. As a program, right, when you think about a degree as an overall, you have checked the boxes. I think completion is a necessary step. I don't think it measures anything helpful for you except that people have gone through a program. But I think about, Jonathan, exactly what you just said, right? People halfway through the video and they're like, no, I get it, I understand. Can they test out of it? right? Does that count as completion? If the answer is yes, then sure, maybe that matters. But you actually want to know, did they learn what they were supposed to learn? And you don't get that from a yes or no box. And so as a you've hit your criteria, I think completion is great. We've trained all these people 100%, and so this thing is complete. That makes sense. But as a measure of whether or not your program is effective or people are learning what they're supposed to learn, no, I don't think completion matters quite as much.
And that's you're both bringing up a really interesting point here. It's also a matter of like, what's the feedback you're getting around why they are not completing it. And that always seems to be a missing piece, especially with learning at work, is you see, that a lot of the learning management systems out there that are they're built for desk workers and they're repurposed for deskless workers. And so the engagement is abysmal. It's why we're here at Opus, it's why we exist. But what if there were an opportunity for someone to say exactly why they didn't complete that course and have that opportunity? Instead, what happens is there's no mechanism to communicate that, which was to your earlier point, Jonathan. And so people just, ghost the course and never come back. What a shame. And what like a missed opportunity for the instructional designer or for the administrator to get real feedback from their learners. Something that we see all the time at Opus is, and it actually initially just happened instinctually in our platform. We have a survey capability. And we initially built it because of COVID, people needed to get real-time feedback from their workforce about how safe they felt returning to work. And it was a part of our communication tool. But when we released our micro course builder, where restaurants, manufacturing facilities could build their own text message courses, in the alpha version, we actually saw training managers just putting a little survey at the end of the course. Hey, what'd you think? They wanted that feedback. People are craving feedback from their learners around how well they did. It's just such a human nature. It's human nature. So it would make sense that when we're thinking about completion, we should also think about a lack of completion and the why.
Yeah, one thing I will add to that, I mean, like, so I teach as well, and like I teach some non-credit courses. And there's a pathway for students to take those courses without a grade, right? But the process is clunky. There's like a form that needs to be filled out, but in order for the form to be approved as taking the course not for credit, you have to have your instructor sign off on it, right? And that's a real antiquated way, but it ensures that there's a conversation. And I think that's important, of why someone isn't going to complete the course for a grade or even complete the course at all, right? And a lot of times those conversations go something like, I got really busy and I just don't have the time to do it right now, or I'm actually really struggling with this, right? And then it becomes a conversation of like, well, how do we catch you up, right? So I think, and they're never the same conversation when I have them, right? And I think that is what's beautiful about understanding what is motivating a learner, because although they might fall in a bucket that might be generally similar, every situation is so nuanced. And if you really want to serve your students, you have to be having those nuanced conversations to understand why they're dropping off or why they're not completing. Otherwise, you're just not meeting their learning need at the end of the day.
So we've kind of run through as quickly as possible. We've gone through what e-learning is, what is the LMS, what is kind of the pro LMS and the anti LMS features, what's the history of different methodologies. We've talked about metrics and measurements. We've talked about the past and we've talked about the present. Now I want to talk about the future. So if I could wave a magic wand and push the both of you into 2030, what predictions do you have for what that next or what the end of that decade might look like when it comes to technology and learning through technology?
I can start with my like less optimistic side, which I think is we're still going to have options like we have today. Like we'll still have like the blackboards, Sam, like you're mentioning. I think that those will still be around in a decade, right? And we'll still be like grappling with those. But I think the platforms of the future are not going to look like anything that looks like an LMS. And I think that's one reason why I'm really excited about what Opus is doing. Like, I think Slack can actually be an LMS, right? I think Discord can actually be an LMS. I think Facebook can be an LMS, right? So I think we will see platforms that we know and love become our learning management systems. And I think it will, take a great group of technologists and educators to get us there. I think back to when I was an undergrad and Twitter was like kind of starting to be a thing. And there was a faculty member that only shared homework assignments if you followed him on Twitter, right? There's a little bit of an ego piece there, but I was like, he was on to something at the time. And it was that these platforms that are integrated into our lives should be the place where we learn as well, right? And I think that is the future. And, in 10 years' time, I hope that's where we get, is that LMS isn't a separate place for us. It's actually just an integrated piece of how we move about the world.
I'm going to be a little bit more philosophical. I think we're going to change what we think learning means. And I think that is going to be absolutely critical to any delivery system. Is there pride in what you're learning? How can you share with people that you're doing this? How can you encourage folks to learn with you and do the same things that you're doing, or learn something that they wouldn't think about before? And again, going back to adult education, the reason I've got into this field is because I was seeing so many folks who, after the age of 18, was like, well, I've done school, I'm not going to college, I've learned everything I can learn. And the things that you're seeing now are people being able to sign up for a webinar about literally anything. You can tune into NASA's Instagram and watch a rocket launch. And so I think the thought process behind how we learn and what we learn is going to influence very deeply how we learn those things in the future. It is going to be more collaborative. It is going to be more organic, and it's going to be something that we believe fundamentally humans should do: pursue knowledge, pursue it in collaborative ways. And those systems that we come up with will always have that as a foundation. How do we bring people together? How do we make this an open group kind of conversation?
I love that, and it brings to it brings to the surface the notion of learner-centered design. And one thing, so our approach at Opus is around situation-based learning, which is, and I'm only speaking in the context of work, which is what we do. It's that what's happened in the training world at work up until now is that there's this compliance-based approach. So your LMS is actually like a CMS. It's a compliance management system. But what that does is it puts corporate at the center of all learning. So situation-based learning finally puts the learner at the center. I think it's a question of how much employers are willing to relinquish that power and how interested they are in listening to who those learners are and what they want. And I think the two of you are alluding to a very optimistic future where that's actually possible. We're seeing indications that this is happening. The instructor wants feedback from the user. They even want them to follow them on Twitter. Okay. But whatever it may be, people are looking, we're all just human. And at the end of the day, we want to feel connected and heard. So it seems like the future is very bright. So let's end on a little bit more about the two of you. I think our listeners are interested to hear. This question is very open. So what's the last interesting thing that you read or learned or consumed out in the world today that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today?
Jonathan, you go first.
For sure. I think the last book that I read, I'm teaching a summer course right now for high school students. It's an art history course. And so we're reading the book called Louise Nevelson, Art is Life by Laurie Wilson. So it's a deep dive into Louise Nevelson, who is a sculptor, like what her creative practice looks like from kind of a psychoanalytic stance. So I've been discussing that with high school schoolers for the last 2 weeks. So it's been a fascinating read to see it through a different lens. So I don't know, I connect that to, I think instructional designers are creative humans. They're artists in their own right. They're designers by training, but artists in their own right. So very interested in that space. Sam, what have you been reading?
I've been trying not to read. The last 2 years have been super stressful. Every time I learn something new, I'm like, oh God, can I unlearn that? And so I've actually been going back to things that I've already done in the past. There's an author named Amy Bender. I don't usually love authors, but anything this woman writes, I want to read, and I will read it 6 or 7 times. And she has this book called The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake. And I can't even describe it. It's a very strange book, but there's a sense of fantasy to it, but a sense of realism that allows you to be okay with not being okay and still understand that the world operates outside of you. And so I've been looking for things that take me either out of whatever's happening right now or as a little bit of a shine or a spin to it. And Amy Bender's work does that for me. And then separately, I just watch a ton of anime because, why not? But yeah, that I would say Amy Bender has really kept me going for the last 2 years.
Both great reads, it sounds like. I'll grab the links from the two of you and we'll put them up when we post this chat. I know one thing that comes to mind, and you inspired me earlier, Sam, when you were talking about how you started to become fascinated with birds, specifically learning about that the pigeon was the rock dove, which I did not know. Thank you. So I love music. It's a big part of my day when I'm working, when I'm not working, when I'm running, when I'm walking. And I try to just incorporate new kinds of music all the time. Helps me think differently. But the New York Times came out with this playlist. It's on Spotify called 5 Minutes That Will Make You Love Choral Music. And it's about, I think I have it open, it's 18 different tracks of choral music from around the world. And it's so fascinating to listen to, just like the fact that it hadn't even occurred to me that the one thing that really unites us around the world is like how we interact with instruments, even our own voice, and how like similar all of these different patterns were, but also how dissimilar so many of them were. So it was really eye-opening. I mean, I listen to it all the time now. And so now it's no longer interesting because I've listened to it a million times, but I need another
recommendation. Bold title for them to start out with. So I'm really interested now in
I know. Well,
what that conversion looks like.
It's their damn job to get us hooked in, and then that's what got me. But they won, so. Well, Sam Barrow, Jonathan Williams, total pleasure to talk with you. I love talking with the two of you about learning. It is obvious we have about another hour that we should have included in this conversation, but I appreciate the two of you for taking so much time to share your thoughts and your strong opinions about the world of e-learning and non-traditional learning. It's a conversation we're going to be having, sounds like, for the rest of our lives. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks for having us.